Okay, what's your name?
My name's Carl Jefferson Weaver.
Okay. What is your age, if you don't care to tell, or your date of birth?
I'm 85. I was born March 17th, 27.
March, good month. That's my month too.
St. Patrick's Day.
Oh, hey, yes.
St. Patrick's Day.
Are you married?
Right.
That lady right over there.
That lady right over there. We just spent our 66th wedding anniversary.
Oh, well, how wonderful. Happy anniversary. And what is her name, since she's not going to tell me?
Ain't you gonna tell him, Mom?
No, she doesn't want to talk to me.
Her name is Murdy Nadine.
Okay.
And her name was Murdy Nadine Horner.
Horner. Okay. How long have you lived in this area?
Well,
All your life?
we lived in Dayton for a while,
Did you?
but you'd have to say we lived all of our life right around here.
Were you born in this area?
Yes.
Do you remember who your neighbors were all the time that you've been here?
Well, I remember college were our neighbors, and I remember I can't remember who lived in Piney Wallace. They lived right in neighbors. And then down at the end of before you cross the bridge in Laurie, I don't know whether you know anything about Laurie or not, but you come down over the hill past Antioch Church. We lived there on the bank, and then Julie Perry lived on the bank right below us. And then you come to the bridge down here, and Jerry Dutiel had a grocery store, and he had the first post office right there. And then you cross the bridge, and that's where the old mill used to be. Right there, where that bridge crosses that creek, that's where the old mill was below that. Now, that was before my time. The mill was before my time. But they had the old covered bridge there. And Jess Robinson lived across the creek on the other side of it. And then Ed Bailey had a little store up on top of the hill above where we lived. He had a little store there. And my dad, I still say, my dad, like I was telling Ruth, her and I was first cousins. I was telling Ruth, my dad had the first filling station and garage there was in Laurie. And he had a blacksmith shop. He was a blacksmith. He fixed automobiles, and he had one of them old hand pump gas tanks. Pump the gas up, it'd pump up 10 gallon. People would come by, and if they wanted gas, if they bought 2 gallon, you was really just making a sale. But he was the first one that ever had gasoline and had a garage and done that kind of work there. That was in the early 30s. And he probably was doing it before I was big enough to know anything about it. Of course, I was born in 27, but I'd say he was doing it then. But then after that, after the 30s, things began to change. But the first school, when my dad went to school, of course, he lived, of course, I can't point and show you. He lived back over in the back country here, and Ruth's dad they were brothers. They lived up in the holler, and what little bit they went to school, they went a little bit. I know he could write a little bit, but you couldn't hardly read it. But they had to walk from over there out in that holler and come to Laurie. And the first church school they went into was an old church house. It was an old Methodist church house, if I ain't mistaken now. I might be mistaken about that being a Methodist, but that's the first place they went. Then the Laurie School, they built it in 1925. The one that's down there that they just tore down here in the last few years. They built it in 25, and my brother started the school in 25. So that's some of the things I remember.
Okay. Was your parents from this area?
Oh yeah.
What's your grandparents?
My mother, they came from Kentucky.
Kentucky.
And if I ain't mistaken, that was Louisiana, Kentucky.
Okay.
And she used to tell us it wasn't no town where they lived. It's just a kind of a crossroads, so to speak. And she said that I said, well, what was the name of where you come? She said they called it Torchlight, Kentucky. But she was from there.
Yeah.
They moved into this country, but my dad was born right here around Laurie. And we all just grew up here as poor as anybody else. There wasn't much, and Collett lived right next door to us. And Tiff Collett, you probably got that in some of your books somewhere. Tiff Collett was over the county, and Collett lived there, and their house burned down. I remember I was just very young, and their little baby burned up. And my dad, when they hollered, "Look out there!" They hollered and told my dad their house was on fire, and he run up to see if he could get in the house. But when he knocked the window in, the fire just rolled out of the house, and the little baby had burned up. But anyhow, it was some hard times. And of course, I can't remember everything that happened, but we was always right around that blacksmith shop in that garage, and people was coming, and Dad was shoeing their horses, and if I remember a man asked him one time, said, "What can you do about a wagon?" He said, "If you can bring me the 4 spokes that goes in the wheel, I can put the wagon on." For he made the wheels and made the spokes in the wheels and the whole thing. He done it all, and he put the tires on the wheels. See, here I'm talking too much, probably, but
No.
he'd make the wheel, the wooden part of the wheel. Then he'd get flat iron for that goes on the outside of that, and then he had a machine that he called it a shrinker. I'll never forget. And he had a thing, and he'd make that tar, and he'd have it up on sawhorses. And he'd take this thing and go around that tar to see how much it took. And then he'd measure how much flat iron he had. And he'd take that and he'd heat that flat iron and he'd put it in that shrinker and he'd bend that flat iron till it would fit that wheel, fit that tar. Mm-hmm. And then my brother and I, we kept a fire under that tar iron, all the time. And he'd take that and he'd pick it down, and he had there was 2 big sycamore trees right out there, a little piece, and he had a cement trough about that wide, and I don't know, so long, had water in it, and he'd pick that tar iron up and set it down over that wooden wheel, and then he'd take that wheel off of that tar, and he'd roll it to that cement trough, and he'd put it down in there, and when he cooled that tar iron, it shrinks so tight to that wooden wheel, you could hit it and it just about ring. Wow. That was the idea of the whole thing. And then he had bolts that went through it, and he'd bolt that on, and he done everything that needed to be done. He done it. He could make anything. And people would be cutting ties back in the tills, you know, and if they broke her axes or something, they'd bring them and he'd weld them a new bit on that axe. And he knew just how to temper that to get it, and whenever he'd temper that, he'd bump that against the anvil and it'd just ring he just had a ring to it. And he had that forge there, and of course my brother and I, we had to turn it. We turned that, and he'd get stuff so red hot, get metal so red hot, and you had to have it hot, you know, to make it weld. You couldn't just get it warm, and he'd have it some just about some melting hot. If somebody had an axe that was broken, and the bit was broken, and he'd flatten this iron out, he'd get it red hot, and he'd weld it right onto that axe part. And he'd temper that, and he'd fix that to it just cut like any other axe that I was supposed to cut. So I remember all that kind of stuff. He could do about anything, did do anything, and finally, after the WPA got to going, they asked him, and he went to Portsmouth, and he run the shop. What I'm trying to think of, I can't think of it. blacksmith shop. He run the blacksmith shop in Portsmouth, and he fixed tools at the county and them things, and used on the WPA.
Wow.
So it was all that kind of stuff. But it was just, it was a lot. And then when the war come along, naturally, he went to Columbus and went to work in Columbus, trying to make more money for so many people back then. Now, not knocking any people or nothing, but people would come and have their things fixed, but very seldom they had anything to pay for it with. And so he had 2 log books there, for bills where he had where people never could pay it, but they didn't have nothing to pay it with. But you could just about count on if a man told you he'd pay you, he'd pay you if it was 6 months later or whenever it was. But it was that kind of thing. So that was just a thing of the times and the way they went. And everybody was poor. Nobody had anything at all, hardly. But we lived there, and he made a little money. He made enough to. We had enough to eat, but he'd shoe them horses. I remember he told the man asked him what it cost him to shoe his horse. Of course, that didn't include, but he'd shoe a man's horse with 4 shoes and fit them up and put them on and nail them on for $1.25.
Wow.
And sometimes them horses, when he'd be shoeing their rear feet, they'd kick like that and they'd sling him back out into the gravel. Yeah, but then they had, some people bring, I don't know why, I'm thinking about how it was, but they'd bring their mules or something, and they had what they called twitches. They put on them to get their mind. That twitch when they put on them kept their mind off of what he was doing. For they'd kick him, and they'd put a thing. They'd get a hold of their nose, and they'd put a twitch on it. It was a rope and a handle, and they'd slide it up over his hand and put it on their nose, and they'd begin to tighten that, and they'd tighten that so tight that if you'd stick a needle in it, it looked like it would burst. But that would hurt them so bad, they got their mind off of what he was doing. And then sometimes they'd put it on their ear, and they'd twist their ear. But you had to do something, because they just wouldn't stand there and let him nail them shoes on them. And sometimes he'd catch them nails when he drove. They'd kick you and stick in his legs. But that was just the way it was. Well, you're about done with me. I don't know much. I've done too much now. But I wanted to tell you, I know that he had the first garage and first filling station there was there, unless somebody else can tell you somebody earlier. But I remember the old gas pump when they took it out. When people would get their gas, they'd get a gallon or 2 gallon, and it was about 15 cents. Sometimes it might have been about 12 cents. And but the people wanted you to say, now be sure and drain the hose now. For a little bit would stay in that hose, and they wanted every bit they got. And then I remember we had an oil drum kept in the garage there. Had an oil drum, something else I'll tell you before we quit. Had an oil drum, and whatever people wanted, motor oil, whatever kind they wanted, we got it all out of the same barrel.
Oh.
It didn't make any difference what grade it was. You had a pump on it and pumped it up. But Dad also had a Delco light plant. See, everybody else didn't have lights, but we had lights. He had a Delco light plant, and he had a big light plant, and he had a row of batteries over there. They was clear glass batteries, and he kept them charged up. And when people wanted to listen to the fights or something, or like Joe Lewis and them, well, they'd bring a radio, and Dad'd charge their battery up for them, and they could go listen to it. But that, of course, we had lights. Now it wasn't electric power. It was about 36 candle power. But we had electric lights, and then college finally got them a Delco, our next door neighbor, and they fixed. They fixed it. They had lights, but most of the people didn't have lights. Then the electric come through, and all back in the early 30s. And I remember the electric, if I'm not mistaken now, God forgive me if I am, if I ain't mistaken, when they come through with the electric, I think it cost us $2 a month, whether you used it or not.
Well,
It just cost you that much for putting us through. And then these hollers, they didn't have no electric or nothing like that, but you come right through Laurie, and people in Laurie, it was just a gravel road. I remember in the winter time, people hauling with wagons, hauling ties and things, they'd be ruts so deep. But now they had some of them old cars, and real old cars, you know, and they had tires, oh, I don't know, it was about 26 inches big around, and the tar wasn't very big, but they'd get down in them ruts, and they'd put chains around their wheels, and when they was going, and you could hear them chains, they'd be flopping them fenders, banging them things. But I remember all that stuff. But I wanted to tell about Dad having a Delco and having a light plant and charging people's batteries. And then he fixed people's car. Back at that time, if you had a car and your roof was a leaking, you just had canvas on it, see. It wasn't no metal, it had canvas on it. And if your doors got rotted out, they was this wood, and they'd make a new, he could make a new thing and set it in your car, fasten it in there, and put your door back. They done the whole bit, the whole thing, but it was just so old-fashioned. And one thing about it, if he needed something, needed a tool to make something, and he didn't have the tool, he'd make the tool. Okay.
thank you, dear. I appreciate it. You did a good job.
Well, I don't know what kind of job, but
You did a good job.
I just remembered all that stuff. I still do sometimes think about it, but I know how it was. It was kind of bad. It was bad for everybody.
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.